Likewise, at the time of Professor Sara de Jong, who is in the Department of Politics and IR at the University of York, where the sunshine is streaming in, and is the co-chair of the University of York Migration Network, which I think is the capacity in which we're going to be spoken to today on the themes. Okay, super. I'm sure it'll come through. If you want to,
I'm
get
happy
started,
to just start. Exactly.
I'll just put up.
Let me just introduce myself first in slightly more detail, because as Luc has already said, I'm an academic and I'm a professor of politics at the University of York. But I've also been engaged with this as part of the Sulha Alliance, which is a charity that advocates for and supports Afghan interpreters that supported the British Army. And so my research on this started about 8 years ago, so before August 2021, when I was interested in how Afghans Afghans who had worked for Western forces were seeking protection and rights from the countries they worked for. So my research was not just focused on the UK, but also looked comparatively at how other countries such as the Netherlands, Germany, France, who also had Afghan employees, were addressing their safety concerns as well as their resettlement. So I'm also the chair of the Sulha Alliance, and I'm speaking partially also from that work where, as part of a charity, I'm in daily contact with Afghans, including those who were affected by the data breach. I'm hoping Luc can share my slides soon. Have you received them, Luc?
It's still not come through on my Outlook. I've refreshed it. Yeah, it's come. It's just arrived now.
Perfect.
So it'll be up in no time.
So most people, I suppose, became aware of the so-called Afghan data breach in July 2025, when the Minister of Defense announced in the House of Parliament that there had been a major data breach, which meant that the details of 18,700 principal applicants had been compromised. And you may recall that he mentioned that this compromising of the data had actually already happened a longer time ago. I'm hoping exactly that Luc puts on my slides. If you could go to the next one. Yes. So there was a major data breach that, as I said, we became aware of in July 2025, when it was officially communicated in the House of Parliament. But it's important to know that this major data breach actually happened in February 2022, and that the MOD itself became aware that this has happened in August 2023. I also have referred to this as the major data breach, just to put this in a context, because it has been revealed after this data breach. The major data breach information came out that over the past 4 years, Arab and DAR, the unit that handles the relocation applications from Afghans seeking safety in the UK, had in fact had 49 separate data breaches, and 4 of those had already been known to the public, but those other 45 had not been made public yet. So as I said, the personal information linked to around 18,700 applicants of the Afghan Relocation and Assistance Program that Carolyn has spoken about were revealed, and also those of another scheme, the ex gratia scheme, which was a scheme primarily aimed actually at Afghan interpreters rather than other Afghans, Afghan interpreters who had worked for the British Army. And that ex gratia scheme already existed long before 2021. And it was a scheme specifically for people who had worked as an interpreter on patrol with British Army soldiers. And so they were always already exposed to lots of risks. And this scheme allowed people who had worked for more than 12 months outside of the wire, so in patrol roles, to come to the UK. So the data that was leaked refers to applications made on or before the 7th of January 2022. When the MOD became aware of the leak in August 2023, that was actually also the same time that I personally became aware of the data breach. I suppose because I'm working in this context, I'm in contact with a lot of Afghans, I'm in contact with a lot of stakeholders and experts in this field. Of course, there were some people who became aware, and at that point, there was also a journalist who became aware. And when the MOD became aware that there were others who had simultaneously become aware, they decided to go to court and ask for what is called a super injunction, which meant that people weren't able to communicate that they were aware of this data breach, and they were also not allowed to communicate about the fact that there was a super injunction. So not only could we not talk, but we could also not talk about the fact that we couldn't talk, if that makes sense. So yes, I myself was aware of this data breach about 22 months before it was finally officially communicated, and have been discreet with that information, of course, as a result of that super injunction. So I've just put on the right side of the slide a picture just to give people a better understanding of what it meant from an Afghan perspective to be subjected to this data breach. So most Afghans who were affected weren't told about the fact that their data had been breached until July 2025. So I think it was a Wednesday that the minister spoke in Parliament, maybe Tuesday, and just a few hours before, and also in the hours that followed, Afghans whose data had been breached were receiving an email in which they were told that their data was likely compromised. And they also received a link to what was called a self-checker, and they could input in that link, their kind of reference number for their application. And if their data was compromised, this kind of red message came up that you see on the right-hand side. So it just explains, our records indicate that personal data from the reference number you supplied is likely to be affected by the data incident. And I think, again, here it's meaningful to say that I'm part of the Sulh Alliance, and as part of this, our charity runs 2 WhatsApp groups that provide support for Afghan interpreters who have now been resettled to the UK, where they can exchange information, ask questions to our team, help each other. And what you can probably imagine is that on that date in July 2025, we had lots of people who started sharing that they had received this email from the MOD and that they had received the red self-checker. Next slide, please. Yeah, great. As you can see in the self-checker, what's really interesting is that the Ministry of Defense had not only waited for a very long time to communicate to people that their data was compromised, but also once they were informing individuals that their data may have been compromised, they were not giving any exact information about what type of individual information may be compromised. Now, just, I really want to get away from just thinking about this in abstract terms. So what you have to imagine is that an Afghan who has worked for the British Army or for British organizations would have applied to be resettled under the Afghan Relocation and Assistance Program or under ex gratia. And as part of that exchange, they would have uploaded various types of information about their employment history. They would also have mentioned the dates of birth and the names and details, relationship details of family members. Because under the schemes, normally what happens is that principal applicants, so the person who has worked for the British Army or for other UK government institutions, can bring family members who are under 18, dependents, children, and their wife or husband with them. And if they have very good reasons, this is in exceptional circumstances, to bring additional family members. So that could be a father or mother, for instance, if they would be medically dependent on the person and therefore not able to be left behind in Afghanistan if the principal applicant would be brought to the UK, they would also be able to perhaps bring this person. So as part of this data gathering, when people apply, they would also maybe say, please also bring my mother because my mother is very seriously ill and dependent on my care, or my brother is disabled and living with me. And they would have also included the information of that individual. It could, of course, be that then the mother or the father or the brother would have been brought to the UK, but it can also have been that the Arab team would have decided to only bring the principal applicant, children and spouse, and that the other family member about whom there was communication would still currently be in Afghanistan because their application was rejected. So what you can imagine from the perspective of affected Afghans is that many of them, having only been informed about this, years after their data was compromised, they started thinking back about everything they would have shared with the responsible unit for the relocation. And they would have started doubting what exact information of them would have been leaked. Was it just a name? Was it also their family? You could see in the self-checker that there is a warning from the MOD that family information could also have been compromised. And then, as you could see in the self-checker, the Ministry of Defense provided security advice, which you can also find still on the Ministry of Defense website. And that security advice looks as follows. You can see that the Ministry of Defense advised people to be vigilant about phone calls from unknown numbers, to be vigilant about social media profiles, to consider using a virtual private network rather than direct access to the internet. And then it says also that family members could be affected and therefore, of course, should apply the same security advice. And then in the final paragraph on the slide, you can see that they are advising that if any person who was informed that their data was breached is still outside of the UK, they should not travel to a third country without a valid passport and visa, as that would put them at further risk, as they could be deported back to Afghanistan, for example, from Pakistan. It also says that the MOD was not able to provide support in a third country, such as Pakistan, unless people had already been invited to resettle to the UK. You can imagine that this security advice raised lots of questions to Afghans who were affected by the data breach. The first question was about how to apply this security advice if people could only apply that from the moment they were aware that their data was breached. So for instance, if the MOD tells us that it is important that social media profiles are hidden, of course, people can't travel back in time and retrospectively change their Facebook account or their Twitter account or Instagram account. There's also, of course, restrictions in terms of what people can do in Afghanistan, as you can see here. While people in the UK may feel that they're able to take some of these security measures, if you're in Pakistan or in Afghanistan, you may need further support, but you may not be able to. As is explained here, you wouldn't get that. As Caroline has already explained, there was an Afghan response route set up by the Ministry of Defense for a small group of Afghans who was affected by the data breach. So this is really only a fraction of it. It's really important to know this. So as I said, 18,700 principal applicants were on the list and their data was breached. When the Ministry of Defense looked back at that list, they realized that there were a group of people who would have been eligible to ARAP in the first place, and they reviewed their applications and they have now resettled them under the normal Afghan relocation and assistance program. So that was, I think, about 3,000 something principal applicants. And they also decided that there were 1,531 principal applicants who wouldn't normally have been eligible, but they judged that they would now be at risk because of their data being compromised, and they have brought those people together with family members to the UK. But we don't know, and there's no information yet publicly available, how the government has made those decisions about who was selected for the Afghan response route and who was not selected for the Afghan response route. So until now, a certain the number that is known is that about 27,000 people in total have been resettled, who were kind of linked to that list. that was breached. But that is including the family members. And those of you who are familiar with Afghan culture will know that most family units will be 4 or 5 family members at least. And so if you would look at 18,700 principal applicants times 4 or 5, we're looking at about 74,000 people who have potentially been affected. And the people who have been brought to the UK are only a small number of those. What was also important to know about the security advice, the communication by the MOD, that while they gave security advice and a self-checker, there was no designated contact point to raise questions or concerns. So there was no email address to say, if you have any concerns or questions, please contact us here. Next slide, please. So what are the impacts of the data breach then for individuals concerned? It is very difficult to speak about this in general terms. Like Caroline, I have some research that is ongoing that I can't quite present here yet. It's collaborative research with an academic colleague and a charity, where we have done a survey among affected Afghans and asked them to report what the impact has been. And I think it will be really important to foreground their voices and to hear from themselves how they describe the effects. And the effects, of course, as you can imagine, may fall down in at least 2 different categories. One is, what are the kind of Taliban security threats that people think are a result of the data breach? And secondly, what kind of psychological and physical impact has the awareness of the data breach had on people who have been affected? But as I said, I think it's really important to say that we can't generalize the impact, because of course there is a different impact on those Afghans who have already been resettled to the UK versus those Afghans who are currently in Afghanistan or in third countries such as Iran or Pakistan. And again, that last group also breaks down in people who have already been promised resettlement, so who are maybe not feeling fully secure at the moment, but who have a kind of promise of future security, versus those who have not received an offer for resettlement, even though they know that their data was affected. There might also be differences between, in terms of how sensitive the information was that people have shared with the team that is responsible, with the unit that is responsible for the resettlement. So have you, for instance, as I said in my previous example, shared the details of your disabled brother, and has he then been rejected for relocation, then you would potentially be more worried. But also depending on your role, there you may have the feeling that people or the Taliban already knew anyways about who you were and what you had done, or you feel that the data breach has really exacerbated your situation. So as you may know, the government commissioned a former civil servant, Paul Rimmer, to write a report on the impact of the data breach. And in his report, he claims that the Taliban already have access to significant volumes of data, which enables them to identify personnel associated with the former government. But the Afghan Relocation and Assistance Program, as Caroline already mentioned, provided relocation for a broad group of Afghans, some of whom were indeed linked to the former Afghan government, but many of whom were not linked to the former Afghan government, but who were working as civilian interpreters, for instance, for the British Army. So they could still feel that the data breach has really put very new information to the Taliban. There have also been Afghans who reported to us that they have been quite unhappy about all the media exposure the data breach got, because they were very worried that even if the list wouldn't have been in the hands of the Taliban so far, of course, making the Taliban aware of the value of the list would actually put them at increased risk. As I said, then you have principal applicants versus family who will be differentially affected. And I think finally, we need to place this in a broader context of how this information and this news about the data breach impacted people. On the right, you see a picture of some of the interviews, with a quote from some of the interviews that I conducted previously with Afghan interpreters. And you can see him say here, "I feel tired, but I cannot sleep. The things I've seen." Afghan interpreters worked in really risky situations for the British Army, were exposed to, of course, a lot of violence for extended period of times. And so many of them already suffer with long-standing security concerns, a loss of trust in several institutions, both UK government and Afghan institutions, including manifestations of PTSD and trauma. And so the news about the data breach has to be contextualized with this longer-standing sense of a loss of security. And then just to finally give some context from the Afghanistan side as well. As many of you know, last week the Taliban briefly shut down the internet first in some provinces of Afghanistan and then in the whole of Afghanistan. And so there have also been geopolitical events happening after the data breach was made public that will make people increasingly aware of the way in which the Taliban is using data and is avoiding the surveillance and protection efforts of other countries. And so that again would have led to a heightening of concern about the data breach. Thank you.